This week, a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie is being released directly to Netflix. It has been nearly 50 years since the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie came out. Since then, there have been 7 sequels spanning from 1986 to 2017. Some were sequels to the original, some were sequels to each other, and some are just completely unrelated. If you haven't seen every single movie, but you still want to watch the new one, it's tough to know what you need to know beforehand, what sequels do or don't count, what are the important details, and who are the returning characters. So, I thought I would put out a video, very briefly highlighting the history of the franchise and laying out everything you need to know before watching Netflix's 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out in 1974. Texas Chainsaw Massacre tells the story of Sally Hardesty, who travels with a group of friends to her family's Texas farmhouse and discovers the Sawyer family, a group of crazed, murderous cannibals living next door. As her friend group is attacked one by the chainsaw-wielding Leatherface, who wears a mask of human skin, the survivors must do everything they can to escape. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a revolutionary movie that changed horror for decades to come. The movie's DNA can be seen in many later slashers. It's a movie so iconic, even if you haven't somehow seen it, you've still probably seen it. At the very least, you're aware of horror icon Leatherface, and you have seen some snippets, like the famous family dinner scene, or the ending with the pickup truck and the chainsaw tilt-a-whirl. Texas Chainsaw Massacre's resume, legacy, and impact speaks for itself. There's a reason an entire franchise was built from it, and the later sequels are constantly trying to replicate its massive success. After the first movie, somewhat surprisingly, a sequel did not come out for 13 years. Then, in 1986, Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 was released to theaters. The second movie once again starred Leatherface and the cannibal Sawyer family from the first movie hunting down a new set of victims. But this time, it took a much more comedic approach. This is clear as soon as you see the poster, which was a parody of The Breakfast Club. Part 2 featured a lot more jokes, wackiness, and over-the-top blood and guts. It was a stark contrast in tone from the grimy, grotesque, realistic, sun-scorched, and serious original movie. This departure in tone really split audiences. Part 2 has developed a cult following over time, but back in 1986, it left many fans of the original confused and hoping the franchise would shift the tone back with the next sequel. Years later, in 1990, that third movie was released. After the last movie divided audiences, the studio CEO echoed fan sentiment and stated he wanted to bring the series back to its gritty roots and replicate the original more closely. However, this movie was even less successful and was pretty universally hated by critics and fans. It didn't have the comedic charm of number 2 and was still far from the quality of number 1. There's not too much to really say about it. It has a 19% critic score, a 31% score from audiences. It was initially given an X rating from the MPAA. As a whole, this was a pretty run-of-the-mill slasher, and if it hadn't starred Leatherface, it likely would have been forgotten over time. After the underwhelming third movie, the franchise was put on hold for 5 years until 1995. And if you thought the last movie wasn't very good, you are in for a wild ride here. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation is so batshit insane, it's gonna sound like I'm just straight up making up its details. It stars Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger. The main plot is that the Sawyer family is hired by the Illuminati to kill a group of kids after prom, and in it, McConaughey's character has remote-controlled robot legs. You heard that right, robot legs. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation is such a departure from the original. It would have been more believable that this footage was instead from a Scary Movie or Terminator sequel. This fourth movie was obviously a total mess, so much so that the studio wasn't even gonna release it. But after McConaughey and Zellweger became breakout Hollywood stars, the film was re-edited and released anyways, where it was met with, shockingly, very little financial or critical success. After consecutive failures, the studio stopped trying to make direct sequels to the original and put the franchise on hold yet again, trying to figure out exactly how to reintroduce Leatherface to audiences. In the 2000s, the franchise was brought back to life the same way many 80s horror franchises were, with remakes. There were two movies, one in 2003 and then a prequel to that remake in 2006. Since it was the era of horror movies like Saw and Hostel, these Texas Chainsaw sequels were no longer as goofy or far-fetched as previous entries. Once again, the focus was on grounded presentation and hard R, hyper-realistic violence that hopefully would live up to the Massacre name in the title and attract fans of modern torture porn. These movies starred famous actresses of the time like Jessica Biel and Jordana Brewster. The plots were fairly simple, groups of young adults going to abandoned farmhouses and being hacked apart one by Leatherface. These two movies still didn't receive rave reviews from critics, but were far from the worst of the series. They both were pretty standard horror movies, and the 2003 film especially is well liked by fans. I would consider both a step in the right direction. Though, for every step forward in the franchise, there are always two big steps back. After the early 2000s reboots, the franchise once again tried to cash in on current movie trends with the 2013 Texas Chainsaw 3D. This came out in the era after Avatar, where every movie and their mother was forcing 3D onto audiences. Texas Chainsaw 3D stars Alex Daddario and is about her character traveling to Texas to reunite with her family, the Sawyers, and her brother Leatherface. There's not a lot of great things you can say about this movie. In any other horror franchise, this would arguably be the worst of the bunch. I mean, Texas Chainsaw 3D only has a 19% score on Rotten Tomatoes. But while you may think that sounds awfully low, surprisingly, that's somehow actually the fourth highest score in the Texas Chainsaw franchise. That one fact summarizes all the sequels better than I ever could. After 3D, the last movie we got in the series was 2017's Leatherface. Leatherface again attempted to kickstart the series, this time by creating a prequel focusing on Leatherface's origins. Leatherface tells the story of a group of young adults on the run from the law. As the story progresses, the central mystery is which one of the teens will turn out to become Leatherface. I'll be honest, this is, in my opinion, the worst movie in the entire series. And honestly, that's a pretty impressive feat, considering again, one of the sequels featured a cyborg Matthew McConaughey. For one, did we really need an origin story for such a simple, straightforward horror character? Leatherface doesn't even talk in the original. How much complexity or room for backstory is there? Also, as soon as you see the lineup of teens, it is just painfully obvious this one kid should be Leatherface due to his sheer size. The movie is well aware of that fact, and so it tries to force a cool twist, revealing this skinny kid actually will turn out to become Leatherface. The other big kid was just a misdirect. And I don't want to get into a rant in the middle of my series summary video, but that is just so fucking stupid. You're telling me this guy is gonna turn into this guy? No fucking way. I'd sooner accept Texas Chainsaw time travel than that bullshit. By now, you're probably starting to notice a pattern. Continued failed restarts for the series, with each new movie introducing some new gimmick, some strange plot element, or a forced tie to the original, with each new sequel finding its own unique way to fail spectacularly. After Leatherface, the franchise was yet again put on ice, so the studio could yet again find a new way to reboot the franchise. For fans of the franchise, after all the bad sequels and nonsensical storylines, there was very little reason to be optimistic. However, in 2019, there was a glimmer of hope. Not only was there a new sequel announced, but director of Don't Breathe and Evil Dead, Fede Alvarez, became attached as a writer and a producer. This time, much like Halloween in 2018, the series was just going to ignore all the other sequels and simply pick up 47 years after the events of the first movie. No cyborg Matthew McConaughey, no Sister D'Addario, just 60-year-old Leatherface, and a new batch of young victims. In summary, after the classic original came out in 1974, there have been a number of failed reboots, remakes, and sequels. All of these movies and their strange secret society and cyborg storylines are being thrown away. This new 2022 movie ignores all those other sequels. The only movie you need to watch beforehand is the original 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This new movie takes place 47 years after the events of the original and will star both original survivor Sally Hardesty and Old Man Leatherface. And if you want an even shorter summary than that, it will be set in Texas, it will likely have a chainsaw, and there will be a massacre. The new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie comes out on Netflix on February 18th, but before it comes out, I was lucky enough to be sent an early copy of the film by Netflix, and I will have a review of the movie on my channel, Horror Flicks with Nick, in the next few days. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, Horror Flicks with Nick. Twice a week I post horror reviews, commentaries, and short recommendations for horror movies you should watch on Netflix and other streaming services. Thank you all for watching my series summary. I'll see you back in a couple days for my review of Netflix's 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Bye!